Hi, I'm Sandy Lowries and I'm the host of the Good Girl Confessional podcast. Please note that I am adding a trigger warning for this edition of the Good Girl Confessional. This podcast contains references to and discussions about online sexual abuse of children. Some listeners may find some of the material traumatic. If any of this podcast is upsetting and you're in Australia, please reach out to Lifeline on 131114. In your own country, please reach out for help. Today in the confessional, my special guest is Natalie Walker, the founder and CEO of PartnerSpeak, a peer support forum providing advocacy and support for the non-offending partners and families of a perpetrator of online child sexual abuse and child exploitation material. Often when perpetrators are caught, the unsuspecting and non-offending intimate partners and their children are shattered just as the victims are, but they are also shunned in their communities without any support. Please welcome Natalie Walker. Hello and welcome Natalie Walker to the Good Girl Confessional podcast.
Hi Sandy, thank you for having me.
Oh, I'm actually thrilled to have you here. And what the subject matter, obviously, that we're talking about today is quite traumatic for a lot of people, and this is a lived experience for you. So first off the bat, I really want to make that perfectly clear. You are the CEO of a quite extraordinary organisation by the name of PartnerSpeak. Can you tell me a little bit about PartnerSpeak and how it started?
Sure. Imagine that law enforcement come knocking at your door. You may be a middle-aged woman married with children and you have no idea why they've turned up, and they're asking to speak with your husband and to inspect all the phones and computers and devices in your house. Eventually, it becomes clear that they're looking for child sexual abuse material that your partner has been involved in online. And so on that day, if the offender has a partner and children, their lives are turned upside down in that second. And while law enforcement and criminal justice respond to him, that's where PartnerSpeak comes in and supports the affected family members who in most cases had no idea that this was going on. How PartnerSpeak started was some time ago now, and there's been a few iterations. The first very humble beginnings were back in 2004, and in Australia in 2004 was the biggest police operation we had ever had to date. 200 men in Australia were charged with offences related to child sexual abuse material in 2004. And at that, if you think back to how you were using the computer and internet back in 2004, some of us still were using a family email shared with other members of a household. I think we had just moved on from dial-up, but there was a lot of confusion in the community about what were these people doing on their computers and how did it harm children. And it was an enormous media storm. At the time, the operation took 18 months, and it was about 18 months after I had discovered my ex-husband was involved with child sexual abuse material. And so when I first heard the media, that was still very raw and traumatic for me, and I ran out of the room when the news was on and wanted to throw up. But the thing that brought me back into the room was that leading news in Victoria was about a husband and wife who co-owned childcare centres together. And she was named again and again and again in print media, radio, television, and she wasn't a suspect at all. But back in 2004, the myth of collusion was so strong that it wasn't even a myth, it was just fact that she must have known. And so that's when I came back into the room and listened to what was going on with the operation and yelled at the radio that someone has to make them stop. and waited for the someone to make it stop, and no one did. And I kind of rolled my eyes and went, not me, someone else. And so that's when it stopped being about me, I guess. And 2004 was a while ago. So I was in my 20s. I was an entry-level community worker. I didn't know so much about how the world or systems or the different tiers of government worked. But I did my best, and I made a few phone calls to agencies and departments that I thought would be allies. And at that point, I didn't even really hit taboo and stigma and blame. That came shortly, but it was more confusion. The people I spoke to were like, what? Men are doing what online? And why would they, and they have partners, and why would their partners even need support? And one of the gatekeepers, I think it was a government department I was on the phone to, just to get rid of me, said, we're not going to do anything, but if you start something, let us know. And then that's what gave me the idea. And at the time, my best friend ran a peer support forum for people affected by a particular health issue. So overnight, we put the first version of PartnerSpeak up as a peer support online forum. And anyone who managed to find us with no SEO or no know-how for the next 8 years, it was mostly me writing back to them.
Wow, that's pretty huge, Natalie. So first of all, I want to say, well done, I guess, on starting this organisation, because, as you say, it's such a dark kind of space to step into and to find yourself in. And that, sadly, I imagine there are more numbers of women and children shattered and left behind by the perpetrators of child abuse, online child abuse, than we actually even know today out there in the media, because this certainly isn't being talked about a lot.
Absolutely. And for all the horrific stories of abuse and harm that I hear, the most distressing part of my job is actually the statistics, because they talk to me about the prevalence. And I know sometimes when we're listening to stories like this, our interest is about something really impactful and compelling that happens to other families, and that's part of human interest, to be compelled by those stories. And I think the most devastating thing I have to say today is that someone who offends in this way, and everybody listening knows someone who offends in this way. So all the stories that I tell today are not stories that happen to other people. They're happening in our families and our communities and our schools. And that prevalence was extraordinary before the impact of COVID and kids being in lockdown and parents working from home and perpetrators being online all day. I'll get to that shortly. But even before the impact of COVID, some European research indicates that 2 to 4% of all men have deliberately accessed child sexual abuse material at some stage in their life. And one of the things, because of my work, I don't go about in the world terribly fearful of what's going to happen to my children, because I understand where harm is most likely to happen. But one thing my brain won't let me stop doing is that when I'm in a gathering of 100 people, is knowing that there's someone amongst us who is committing crimes against children online. And to put that in perspective, how common it is, every 4 minutes there is an image of child sexual abuse being displayed on the internet. And again, statistics, but before COVID, In Australia alone, just to the Australian Centre to Counter Child Exploitation, which is managed by the AFP, we had 21,000 reports of child sexual abuse material. And in the first 6 months of COVID, that increased by around about 129%. And I don't yet have the data about what happened after September till now. And so that's how distressing the prevalence was before the impact of COVID. And there's hopefully the offence will never be normalised in the community, but against offenders are quite brazen, and an international trend over the last few years has been that increasingly perpetrators have been arrested at work, which just like how entitled and brazen, and also it shows us that the people offending against children in these ways aren't someone sitting in the basement of mum's house who lives alone, surrounded by filth and squalor, but it's someone who's getting arrested at his job.
Wow. And there also, I guess, is no, obvious kind of job that person or that these perpetrators have either, because they basically run the gauntlet, don't they?
Yeah, absolutely. And even possibly more so than other types of sexual violence. Next time you read a media report about a child abuse material ring that has been interrupted, you'll probably notice that there's a range of age groups from perpetrators under 20 up until their 70s, occupations from retail to white collar, and of course trusted professions in healthcare and working with children. And one of the most, the other thing that I find particularly distressing is how offending has changed with technology in the last close to 2 decades now that I've been in this space. Back in 2004, when people would hear about the work that I was doing, they would respond in one of two ways, and never in between, never the twain shall meet. Either absolute hysteria, and he's a monster and she must have known, and the whole family is in on it and should be shunned. And then the other extreme was, what's the big deal? He was only looking. And he was, regardless of what has changed with the type of child abuse material, he was never just looking. Every piece of child abuse material is real children being sexually abused and filmed, and then that is sold all over the world, which has always been horrific for me to know and understand. In more recent years, we have been supporting intimate partners who have discovered that their partner's been involved with live streaming of child abuse. And there's a story we shared recently of a woman who walked in on her, I'm going to use her words, and I know you gave some content advice at the beginning, but she walked in on her husband masturbating while telling people what to do in the child abuse scene. She saw the child, the perpetrator, the director, and she walked in on that. And that is just an example about, sometimes I think we still, like people said in 2004, lumping it over into an internet thing, but this is very much not an internet thing. This is real child sexual abuse against real children. And there's an annual report called Net Clean that comes out about child sexual abuse material trends year on. And this year it found with COVID that perhaps perpetrators that had previously been involved with contact offences were now becoming more involved with child sexual abuse material.
Yeah, wow. And that's mind-blowing. And as you pointed out, I mean, technology has kept evolving, and that, you know, we're all very aware now that, you know, pornography is at the fingertips of not just adults, but children. And that I can't imagine, but therefore that technology would be readily available to perpetrators of online sexual abuse crimes against children. But also, is there evidence to prove too that they're getting smarter and that they're more organised in terms of things like the dark net and being able to hide this kind of information from partners, from their children, from their colleagues at work?
I think we're all getting smarter online. So while perpetrators get smarter, so too does law enforcement and their covert operations. However, again, something that I think is shocking for the general public to know, the vast majority of child abuse material is on the clean web, not on the dark web. And sorry, I'm terrible with statistics, but it's here's my technical statistic. It's really high. I think it's something like over 80% of child sexual abuse material is hosted on the clean web. So perpetrators don't actually have to be very clever or technologically savvy. And there is a lot of pressure on social media companies and companies that sell pornography at the moment, where child sexual abuse material is freely distributed.
Wow. So, Natalie, you know, this whole topic is incredibly mind-blowing, and we know that it's going on out there. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about your actual story. So we know how PartnerSpeak started, but what was your lived experience with this, and how have you and your children come through to the other side?
So my lived experience was 19 years ago. And so my children weren't part of the equation. They happened much later in life, which is something that I've always been grateful for, as I've worked with other families where the perpetrator and the non-offending partner have had children. I've also always been grateful that wasn't something, a part of my story and my experience, and that I didn't have small people to protect. So as I said, 19 years ago, I was very young, in my early 20s. And the way that I discovered that my then husband was involved with child abuse material was that we had a mutual friend who had always serviced our computers for us. And we had just moved interstate, and it was a long weekend. And so all his mates had come over for the long weekend to check out our new flat and the big smoke. And this friend who serviced the computer took me aside and said, "Natalie, everybody knows that there's always heaps of porn on his computer, but this time it's something different. There's children." And as I said, my flat had just been converged on by 3 or 4 guys for the weekend. And so I was in complete shock. And so I said nothing for the weekend, and then confronted my ex on Monday. Unlike most of the stories that I've heard in the 17 years since PartnerSpeak founded in 2004. He didn't try to deny anything. But in common with a lot of the stories that I hear, there was far more fallout for me than for him. Those guys who were at our house that weekend were all his best mates and were groomsmen in our wedding, and they knew why we separated and divorced. I told his family. I let his new partner know, even though I didn't know her, because I had heard on the grapevine that she was very keen to have children very soon. There's not much in this story that makes me smile, but there's this one little part. The last time I saw my ex-husband, I took him out. Well, we went out for coffee. I'm sure I didn't pay. And I said, I have two things to tell you. One is I'm going to tell your new partner about why we separated. I feel it's my obligation. Would you like to be there or not? They were his options. And the second thing I told him was, I founded this organisation called PartnerSpeak, and it's for people who learn that their partner's been involved in child sexual abuse material. And he didn't bother to object or try to talk me out of it. And all he said was, well, that's not very surprising, Natalie, is it? Yeah, as I said, that's the only part of the whole experience that does give me cause to smile a little bit. He knew there was no point in trying to talk me down. That of those people that I was open with and I told, including, as I said, we were young, so only one of our friends had children. They all rallied around him and supported him, and I can't remember the exact details, but wouldn't allow me his contact details because I had ruined his life by going to police. And all those people who were groomsmen at our wedding and knew why our relationship ended stood up next to him and were groomsmen at the next wedding that he had. And that part of my story, and so I did have support from other places, but one of the most common threads from the people I talk to, and we don't just support, PartnerSpeak doesn't just support women. We started off by just supporting intimate partners because that was my story and I knew that's what the gap was. And we do still support intimate partners. The majority of them are women in relationship with perpetrators. Sometimes we support men who are in relationships with perpetrators. But the harm that's caused by this offence ripples through the whole family and social circle. So we've supported parents of the perpetrator, siblings, anyone who's been impacted by his offence. And every partner, non-offending partner that comes to PartnerSpeak talks about how they've been blamed and shamed and stigmatised and ostracised. And I can remember a story of a young woman, she was in her early 30s, I think, and she would say, I have no one in my life now that was in my life before the offence. And there's a more recent story in the last year or so that really sticks with me because of the impact of community on this family, and also because it echoes what I have been hearing for 17 years, and how that even though we're becoming more aware of the offence, and it's not like in 2004 where people are saying to me, what's he even doing on that internet thing? And so we have far greater awareness of the offence, but we're not responding to families any better. And so this family, as I said, it was about a year ago, and police arrived about 7 o'clock in the evening so that everyone would be home. They lived in a suburb of Melbourne. It was a mum and dad and 3 kids, including a preschooler. Mum went to great lengths to make sure the children didn't know what had happened. And so that meant she didn't seek support. She didn't tell any friends what was going on for over a year until she found PartnerSpeak. And then when he was finally sentenced, Jenny, which is a pseudonym, though I use her story with consent, asked the judge for a suppression order so that to protect her children, so that identifying details weren't included in media. And the judge refused because Jenny's not a victim. And subsequently, Jenny must have had a sixth sense or something. There were several pieces of media, and some of them really stand out where they named, so they didn't name the children, they didn't name Jenny, but they named the full name of the perpetrator, they named his employer, they named the suburb that they lived in, and they named the small knit community that they were part of. And so Jenny and her children's story was everywhere after her holding that and protecting her children from that for over a year. And everybody in her community knew. And she lost her best friends, and her best friend's children were close friends with her children. So her children lost their friends as well. And even her elderly parents were getting hate phone calls. And Jenny says, as distressing as the discovery of the child sexual abuse material was and is, they had started, they hadn't started, but they could think about starting to rebuild a new life and starting to heal. But it was all the interventions and the reactions of community and so-called friends that was the most distressing part of what happened to their family.
Wow. And it raises kind of another point as well, because it's, you're shattered. You find out that your intimate partner is basically a criminal doing horrendous things by, that is online sexual abuse of children. So your life is shattered. The marriage is over. You're trying to protect your children. And then, as you say, quite often you're shunned in your immediate community. So you lose all of your support networks. How common is that?
Sadly, really common. And, we have such a strong, I say we, I mean Australia and internationally, we have such a strong culture and history of victim shaming. And so in sexual assault, it's what was she wearing? Why was she walking in that park? With family violence, it's why doesn't she leave? And with child sexual abuse material, it's how did you not know? Which is ludicrous. Like I don't want to unnecessarily alarm anyone, but do any of us know what our partner or our neighbour or our brother or our 21-year-old son is doing on their smartphone? Do our partners know what we're doing on our smartphone, whether we're doing a Woolies online order or we've just spent 3 hours on Facebook? But that is the foundation from where the blame comes from in this offence, is how did you not know? And I think the reason people are projecting that is to protect themselves, which it is the case with most victim blaming, isn't it? If it's her fault, then it's something I can stop from happening to me. This is a bad thing that happens to people who don't do better. But if I protect myself and my family, I'm clever enough that this won't happen to me. And I think the how did you not know is saying, hoping that if this was going on in my house, I would know if my intimate partner was involved with child sexual abuse material. There would be some sort of red flashing light on his head that I would pick up. And I think in part, people have to believe that, because it's very destabilizing, and we could go really deep and talk about mental schemas. It could unhinge everything we think we know about the world, our partners, our sense of judgment, ourself, our love. If we think, oh, maybe someone really close to me is doing something like this and I wouldn't know, and we can't bear to think that. So instead, when something like this happens, we project that onto her and say, it must be something about you, or you must have known.
It's really fascinating, and I will say that I myself am a victim of child sexual abuse, and I can openly talk about that now after years of dealing with it. But it's really interesting for me being on the other side of that. And I will say that my learned experience is that you can be a child who is being sexually abused in face-to-face and in real life without people knowing. And so, and that is not necessarily, that's not the case for everyone, but the reality is that that can happen. And so for me, as a victim on the other side of that, or as a survivor of that, that I can logically see how people would not know that what their partner is doing if it's online sexual abuse. And as you say, online sexual abuse doesn't minimize that abuse, because where those images, those photographic images or videos, etc., come from are real life children who are being abused for the sake of these criminals. And so, but I really wanted to make that point that I can see myself, even as a survivor of child sexual abuse, that it would be quite logical in most cases that partners wouldn't know what it's being looked at online. And well, and I can tell you right now, I certainly don't go hunting, and I'm sure most people don't, for, what are their children looking at? What are your partner looking at? What are your friends looking at? I mean, you don't go searching into someone else's iPhone or their laptop necessarily. And so, I can totally understand it. And I guess I wanted to make that point because it's quite devastating that the partners and children of criminals are not getting any support as well. So, there are so many victims here. Yeah. The victims are the children, but they're also the families of those children. They're also the communities of those children, but they're also the partners, intimate partners, as you say, of perpetrators, and more importantly, children. The innocent children of perpetrators who are finding that they, being shunned at school, being found out. And I imagine if you're trying to protect your children and it hits the media, that, it'd be devastating for your children then going to school and other kids knowing about that is their parent who has perpetrated.
Absolutely. And thank you for exposing your own experience to make that point, because I think it's far more powerful coming from you, Sandy, than it is coming from me. And perhaps once we have had the world pulled out from under us and we know everything is upside down and mixed around, we're more able to look behind the veil and understand some of these things that go on. So thank you for amplifying that.
No, that's fine. But I do think as well, as you say, a lot of, abuse survivors, whether it's child abuse, whether it is sexual abuse, whether it's domestic violence, whether it's, whatever it may be, the reality is that people are often really scared to step forward because we do know that victim blaming does go on. I mean, we know that it's, and I don't have statistics in front of me, but there's a lot of research around domestic violence and how long it takes an intimate partner to come forward, if at all, to say that their partner is abusing them emotionally, physically, sexually, whatever it may be. And, while there is support out there for domestic violence victims and survivors, there is still a lot of victim blaming that goes on in that realm as well. And so, so what sort of, I suppose, for me, I would like to know, what do you aim to do with PartnerSpeak? What would be the future?
May I, since we both have storytelling and amplifying women's voices in our blood, may I go back to the pick up quickly on the point you made about the impact on the children of perpetrators.
Yes, please.
So I will tell you about what PartnerSpeak does and what we would do if we were resourced proportionately. But I've been talking mostly about adults, intimate partners and parents of perpetrators because PartnerSpeak does not yet have the resources to support people under 18. We have applied for, together with some really strong research partners and agencies who are experts in responding to child sexual abuse. And an urgent next step for us is to research the impact of child sexual abuse material on the children of the perpetrators, whether or not they were also part of the contact offending. That research has never been done anywhere in the world, and that cohort of victims just don't exist anywhere. And when we talk about traumatic childhood experiences that we measure, such as having a parent incarcerated or the death of a parent, or this is just something we don't measure, having a father who's a perpetrator of child sexual abuse material, and what happens to Jenny's children, who we talked about earlier, who were exposed in the media through association, and who now everyone at school and everyone in their small community knows. And one of the most disturbing for me phone calls that we get is from young men who are now young adults saying, my dad did this, does that mean there's something wrong with me too? And I'm going to do something like that as well. And so there is still desperate need for supporting the adults, the partners and other affected family members of perpetrators of child abuse material. PartnerSpeak only exists in Victoria. Nowhere else in Australia are we funded. So these stories I've been telling you about, if someone has that experience elsewhere in Australia, there's nothing. And as yet, there's nothing for the children of perpetrators anywhere in Australia. And so talking of, say, that young man whose dad was a perpetrator who phoned up, that's one of our most important peer support offerings, is our peer line. So everybody who provides support at PartnerSpeak has the lived experience of being an affected family member close to a perpetrator of child sexual abuse material. And almost universally, anyone who rings us or interacts with us mentions that. They mention how powerful it was that the person they spoke to had been through something similar to what they were going through. And despite the prevalence that we discussed, Sandy, when it happens to you, nearly everybody feels like they're the only person in the world that this has happened to. We read again and again and again of people being charged for the crime. And you will now forevermore, whenever you read a media article like that, ask yourself, I wonder if he had a partner, I wonder if he had kids. But unless you come across PartnerSpeak or this story and you're just consuming that media about child abuse material, rings being busted, our thoughts don't go there. And so it's really important to people that everyone at PartnerSpeak in the support team has that experience. So a lot of people come to us through the peer line, and the number for the peer line is 1300 590 589. Unfortunately, at this stage, it's quite part-time hours, but those hours can be found right smack bang in the middle of the front page on our website, which is partnerspeak.org.au.
And we'll add the links as well to this as well, so that people can look it up again as well and get in touch. Yeah.
Thank you. I have every confidence that you'll do a brilliant job of that, Sandy.
Thank you.
I can't say the peer line number enough. And we have, so that online peer support forum that started back in 2004 has never stopped since that very first day.
Wow.
And back then it was probably a few people a year. And now we have something like 800, 900 active users. And last time I checked, about 130 posts a month. And every single one of those posts is moderated. And again, there's a lived experience community. So people who, the forum now has a dynamic community of its own. And there's also PartnerSpeak support workers checking in there as well. Pre-COVID, we ran face-to-face peer support groups, and we also did run online peer support groups and gatherings as well. Because a lot of people become a single parent through this, and so access to support is super tricky and super important. I've had phone calls with mums who are, have put Peppa Pig on in the lounge room and are in their car, in their garage, having a cup of tea so that they can call PartnerSpeak without their kids hearing. During lockdown, that was a huge issue because the crime type increased, but also, of course, many of us were locked down with our families, and so that often was the perpetrator and the children, and the intimate partner was stuck at home, not wanting him to hear her calls nor her children. So we really quickly launched a web chat during the first big lockdown. And so when the peer lines open, people can also chat in live time. And so that has been super useful for people to talk to us discreetly. We even supported someone who was chatting to us at work, and they did some sort of shift work. So they would say, gotta go, and they would go and work, and then they would come back again. We have one-off kind of gatherings that we can be responsive to the issues that are emerging on the forum, and we work really closely with our community and survey people and ask them what are the issues that they're grappling with. So we might have, and some people don't want to or don't have the capacity to commit to a 6-week support group, and so we might have a pop-up peer support gathering, and it might be about navigating Centrelink and courts and all the bureaucratic systems, or it might be about what do I tell my kids, how do I tell my kids, and sometimes we have pop-up, I think we have one tonight to coincide with Valentine's day. And so at times of year, that can be tricky for people. A really important part, everything, all the peer support we offer is important, and all of it is generated by what families tell us they need. Our support to assist people when navigating law enforcement and courts was at the insistent. Our support for people navigating law enforcement and courts was at the absolute insistence of the people that we support. I remember one of our very first face-to-face peer support groups, a quite quiet, reserved, middle-aged woman who was still in the throes of the crisis when I walked in, and she's like, "That's Natalie Walker, that's the CEO." She sat up and she was animated and she punched the table and she said, "Natalie, you do not let another woman go to a police station on her own. You tell her, you call me and I will go with her." Oh. And wow. And that's so we some of our very first partnerships were with police, because it's law enforcement were the one group of people, apart from the affected family members, of course, that we didn't have to explain what the issue was and why the support was needed, because they knew that they were leaving people in crisis in the fetal position on the floor. And so as we receive referrals direct from police, and something that's really powerful that's happened in the last 18 months or so is, before that, people who were contacting PartnerSpeak, often their experience was historical. They'd see us in the media, or they'd hear something or read something, and they would say, "Oh, I wish something like that. I wish something like that was around when I needed it." But now, because we're better known and because we receive referrals direct from police, we're sometimes supporting people immediately after warrant, when as soon as police have left the house. And we will also provide support in police stations, in courts, because they're, for most people, they're terrifying and foreign places. You know, I've had partners say to me, "I've never been inside a police station. I've never been inside a court. No one in my family has even received a speeding ticket." And we'll also support people if they're engaging in other organisations like family violence services.
Yeah, that's great. And that, you know, PartnerSpeak is able, I suppose, to give out information or numbers to other supporting organisations, as you say, because, you know, that's important as well. Navigating the court system, I think one thing that probably, you know, because I, like a lot of other people, prior to hearing your story and prior to hearing about PartnerSpeak, really never thought about, sadly, the partners, non-offending partners, and we should really really make sure people understand that non-offending partners and children, that's not where my mind ever went. And so, no. Of course, we focus on the perpetrator. We focus on, yes, the police got them and they've cracked this ring of pedophiles. But you're right, we don't think about the partners. And, you know, what I suppose should remember as well is that it's a difficult process for a woman to walk into a police station, as you've so rightly said, to basically tell them that their partner is a perpetrator. That's difficult. So doing that alone, I imagine, would be quite scary. But then in doing that, it means that they are called into the court system. They then become a witness to a crime. So I can't imagine how difficult that must be, to be honest, and especially when there's media involved around that as well, it must be really difficult.
And even if the intimate partner or family members don't find the material themselves, they're often required to interact with the criminal justice system.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. This is, it's just so mind-blowing. So one of the questions I wanted to ask, and I don't know if there's an easy answer for this one, but how have, groups that support victims of child sexual abuse, how have they kind of reacted to PartnerSpeak, and what it is that you're trying to do, which is to support non-offending partners and kids on the other side of this? What's your hope for PartnerSpeak moving forward, and what do you see the future of PartnerSpeak looking like?
So unfortunately, I can't even think about hope at the moment, Sandy, I have to say. I am so desperately tired that instead I'm going to talk really candidly, and I've always been candid and direct as a spokesperson and change maker in this area. But in the last year, that has become even more urgent. So some things that we've talked a lot about how prevalent this crime was before COVID, and those statistics I gave you, which are mind-blowing. And then that between April and September last year, we saw a 129% increase. And that is not going to plateau. Like that it will, my informed hypothesis is that that rate of prevalence will come down a little bit, but we've now got a bunch of new perpetrators. And if we go back to the statistic where I think I said that roughly 50% of perpetrators have an intimate partner and children. So as this crime is increasing, the secondary victims is increasing as well. And I have also mentioned that PartnerSpeak is only funded in Victoria, and we have a significant, we're a funny juxtaposed little organisation because we're just in Victoria. We have a tiny workforce, but we have a national influence. We're on multiple national working groups where we're consulting and advising government departments and national law enforcement. We do international consultancy because there are so few organisations doing work in this area. And so when I talked about the history of PartnerSpeak, I talked about the first iteration. We received our inaugural state government funding from the state of Victoria in 2017. Pre those days, any PartnerSpeak advocacy or momentum was just me and out of my pocket. And I distinctly remember one of multiple times where I flew to Canberra at my own expense with my family in tow. 2016, I remember still breastfeeding my youngest and sleeping on my friend's floor in Canberra and trying to get change happening. And while I don't pay my own way to Canberra anymore, and I now get to sleep in beds when I travel, it still feels similar. It used to just come down to Natalie Walker, one person, and now it still comes down to PartnerSpeak, a handful of committed people in Victoria. And I think something that we do when we talk about change making and activism is that we celebrate people being untiring, and no one's untiring. Everybody tires, and no change maker should need to be so relentless and untiring that the burden comes down to one individual or then a small, tiny not-for-profit made up of a handful of individuals. And so federal government, media, there is urgency everywhere we look in Australia and internationally about this huge increase in offending. And this requires a proportionate government and collective response to the magnitude and the prevalence of the issue that we've discussed. You know, this huge increase of offending that's happened during COVID all around Australia, those families have nowhere to go. So they have been in their trauma on their own with no response from anybody. And it has been really critical that government invests in responding to the families of perpetrators of child sexual abuse material for decades. But now it's urgent, you know, with this new increase. We are just leaving families and children unsupported to wither in their trauma, and we know about it. I've been talking about this since 2004, so we know about it. So it's not so much my hope, but I am desperate. PartnerSpeak is desperate. All the families we're not supporting are desperate for a proportionate systemic response that includes proportionate funding to the breadth of this issue, and which we discussed earlier. It affects all of us.
Yeah, wow. It is a huge issue. And as you say, unfortunately, given the global pandemic, one that worldwide, I imagine, has become more and more of a crisis. Yeah, wow. It is, the whole thing is really, I mean, there's a lot of trauma involved, and I can hear it in you. I can hear how tired you are. And I say that with love and not offense. You know,
absolutely.
Yeah, and this is what a lot of people don't understand about not-for-profits as well. I was recently speaking to Donna Stolzenberg, who is the CEO of the National Homeless Collective and who started the Melbourne Period Project, which now became the Period Project across Australia.
Congratulations to Donna on her recent Victorian of the Year award.
It's wonderful, isn't it? Yeah, really amazing award and so well deserved. But as she was saying, you know, when we were chatting and I said to her, you know, she had not had a single day off in 2020. And I said to her, you know, how do you keep going? How can you do that? And her response beautifully was, well, how can I not? Because although the funding isn't coming, you know, the need is still there and it's greater than ever. And for organisations like you, the same is very true. The funding isn't coming, but the need is very real and continues to grow.
We're taught as not-for-profits and anyone that is approaching philanthropists or funders or is raising awareness like this, we're taught to talk to our strengths and our successes, and of which I can. PartnerSpeak over-delivered by 600% in the second half of last year.
Wow.
And partners talk to us about how PartnerSpeak has changed their life. And I have a few quotes here from during COVID that if there were no PartnerSpeak, I would have had a breakdown by now. Thanks for saving me and holding me strong. This is a difficult experience, and without PartnerSpeak, there would be no connection that makes sense to me. And people tell us how we've changed their life and how something switched when they spoke to someone who's had this shared lived experience on the telephone. And I think testament to the power of peer support and the power of connection and mutuality is that how many of the people we support become advocates, and that they speak out and that they want to be part of the change as well. And so I can speak to the huge impact we have, and of the hundreds, probably more, of people we support. But I think when we're talking about change makers and women in particular, that we all do ourselves and each other a disservice by hailing people like Donna and myself as superheroes and as untiring, because that puts a huge responsibility on a small handful of people when there are massive institutions and businesses and governments that we need to advocate. So Donna can have a day off, and so that I'm not so exhausted.
Yeah, absolutely. And, one of the things that I really, really want to say to you during this podcast, though, is thank you to you and to others like you who you didn't have this support when you were going through this experience 19 years ago. There was nobody, there wasn't an organization out there who was going to reach out to you and say, look, thanks for going to the police and thanks for telling your truth. And as you say, it was really difficult. And it is absolutely mind-blowing to me that the same person who told you what the ex was doing then stood with him at a second wedding as his groomsman. And so there is this kind of unbelievable truth that people will turn a blind eye to the perpetrator, to victim blame the victim. So I'm sorry that you had to go through that and that's your lived experience. But what and I know how tired you are, but what an extraordinary thing that you've done out of your trauma is to create an organization that can support other, other women, and predominantly women. I know they're not all women. So to support other people who are going through that, who are finding out that their intimate partners perpetrators, and to help support them with their journey, and especially those that do have children. That's kind of an extraordinary thing to do. And, you must be proud of the organisation, tiny as it may be. It's helping so many people.
Thank you, Sandy. You are extraordinarily generous with all your guests, and also really humble, because you have a huge role in amplifying these stories and shining a light on this experience and giving momentum to our causes. And back in 2004, I did many interviews that were never aired. A single journalist or may have had the courage to write the story, but then it was axed by their producer or editor. And I know you work hard to dig out these stories and to raise awareness. So you and I together are shining a light. And every time the people who are listening to this now, and they're hearing about PartnerSpeak for the first time, and they're hearing about all these people that have been through something, and they thought they're the only ones in the world, they now feel less alone. And what I didn't realize when I accidentally set PartnerSpeak up, I just thought I would wave to the grown-ups and say, hey, there's a whole group of people over here that you're not supporting. And they'd say, thanks, Natalie, we'll get on to that. We'll extend our service delivery. What I didn't realize is that I created a PartnerSpeak for me. I was telling my story. I was being heard. I had a lot more agency than is experienced by people where they don't get to affect change. And so years and years later, I reflected that, yes, of course, I was traumatized, and yes, I can remember that first year, still now, 19 years ago. But a lot of the power of PartnerSpeak is connecting with others who've had that lived experience, but it's also the power of telling our stories, and I've been doing that since 2004 now.
Yeah, and I do think there is a real power in people who have survivors and victims of all abuse. And this is a form of abuse, that your partner has betrayed you and that your partner has left you in the wake of their crimes and their abuse. But there is a power in people speaking out, telling their stories, which is what this platform is really all about, and giving someone an opportunity to tell their story openly and honestly, and raise awareness that this is going on. Because, as you say, sadly, very sadly, there will be people who are listening to this who may not even know yet themselves that they know people out there who are actually perpetrators of online child sexual abuse. And or there may be people out there who suspect.
Yeah.
And this may give them an opportunity to reach out to PartnerSpeak, to talk to someone confidentially, and ask advice and where to from here. Because I imagine it's a really difficult thing to even know what to do, who to contact, or even what to say when you find someone to talk to. So, one thing I did touch on before, and I know this is a really difficult thing, and I ask you this only because I want people to understand, in chatting to you, this is, I would hope, obvious. This PartnerSpeak in no way is about diminishing the support needed by the victims of sexual abuse, and that there are other organisations out there who can support children who have been sexually abused, who can support women who are being domestically abused, and men, or anybody else. But it is in no way to diminish those victims. It is about getting the word out there that there is an organisation, and you're it, PartnerSpeak. You're the only one of its kind that I've ever heard of, who is there to support the non-offending partners of perpetrators of sexual abuse.
Absolutely, Sandy. When I was in my early 20s, and I accidentally founded PartnerSpeak, it didn't cross my mind that I know you're talking about child sexual abuse more broadly, and I can get to that. But it just didn't cross my mind that we weren't taking care of the children in the images. That was just like such a no-brainer for me. And so I thought, this is a gap supporting the partners and family members of the perpetrators. And I'm speechless still after all these years of how poorly, if at all, we care for the children in those images in Australia and internationally. And I'm so glad you asked this question. It's such an important question. And again, I have consent to tell this story. I worked very closely for a long time with a woman who was an affected partner, and her family at first forbade her from having anything to do with PartnerSpeak, and then forbade her from talking about PartnerSpeak at family gatherings. And they would dismiss her and say, it's not about you, it's about the kids. And every affected family member that comes to PartnerSpeak, that's where their trauma is from, because we're the ones that know. You don't have to tell us that child abuse material is a crime scene of child sexual abuse. We know that in our deepest core. And when we find out and we're rocking and we're crying and we're vomiting or we're withdrawing or staring vacantly or however we're dealing with that discovery, that's what we can't stop thinking about, is the children in the images. And every affected partner processes this in a different way. I know that 19 years ago, and there wasn't much available, but I still found some. I read first-person accounts of survivors in the images. I wanted to understand what they went through and what my ex-husband was doing. And I've supported and worked with a lot of non-offending partners who have gone on to study psychology or social work or law or criminology to be part of the change. And earlier, when I spoke about that, so many of the people we support come out the other end and are advocates. They're not just advocates for other affected family members. They're really strong advocates for stopping and interrupting all types of child sexual abuse.
Yeah, and coming from it with a very lived experience, and hopefully in doing that, and I hope this is true for you as well, that some of that trauma is healed in trying to help other people through that journey as well.
That's our whole model. Yeah, it's wonder. I've told you the distressing stories of people in their trauma, but it's amazing. To really quickly, because I know we're out of time, but I remember someone I saw in one of our very first peer support groups, and she couldn't get through any of them. She was like sobbing from beginning to end through all of them. It was very raw and real. And a year later, when she turned up at our information session, I couldn't believe it was the same person, and someone actually didn't recognize her. And so to see that's the power of connection and mutuality, and knowing that there's not something wrong with us, that something, and this is with much trauma, and maybe this resonates with you, with your experience, Sandy. Something really hideous and horrific was done by another person to you, but there's nothing wrong with us. And when we come together and share those stories, that's when we realize it was about the other person, and it's in coming together. That is what the healing of peer support is all about.
Yeah. And it is, you're 100% right in meeting and talking with other people who have, I mean, the way that we all deal with our trauma, we're all individuals and it's all different, of course, but in meeting other people who have a lived experience similar to yours, or who at least has some empathy or understanding of what that means and what you go through, absolutely does help the healing process, I think. And in shining a light on it, and what PartnerSpeak is doing is shining a light on, on trying to change the narrative around those left in the wake of these crimes, and trying to support those people whose lives have been shattered also through no fault of theirs. And that's something really important. And just like, as you say, all other victims of crimes, the victim blaming really should stop. So I want to say a big thank you to you. I know this is an emotive topic, and I know that it's a really difficult topic to speak about, for you and for everyone. And so thank you very much for coming on and sharing your story and being so honest and open about that as well.
And thank you for having the courage to invite me and to delve into this place that is horrific and horrible and none of us want to think about. So thank you for your courage.
Thank you very much for your words. And as I said, we will put up the links to PartnerSpeak below. If you find yourself in this situation, or if you are concerned about someone in your life, absolutely reach out to PartnerSpeak, have a chat confidentially and find out, perhaps we'll get some advice on what to do next. So I thank you very much for being on the podcast and for sharing your story.
Thanks, Sandy.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to the Good Girl Confessional podcast. The Good Girl Confessional podcast is brought to you by WB40, Women Beyond 40 magazine, available now at WB40.com. The Good Girl Confessional podcast is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever you listen to quality podcasts. We're also now available on YouTube. We chat with really interesting women about their hard-won wisdom, but it really helps us if you can subscribe, like, and share the podcast. Thanks so much for your support. Bye for now.